Hi, everyone. My name is Sandra Khalil. I'm a program associate with All Tech is Human. It's such a pleasure to have you all today. I love the energy in the room, and I'm looking forward to having a great conversation. I have the honor of moderating a great conversation today with, it's surrounding the pervasive issue of online gender-based violence. I'm sure we've all known folks who have endured this issue, and it's really important to keep talking about it. I have the honor of introducing my two esteemed colleagues here. Vaiddehi Bansal is a research director at NORC at the University of Chicago, where she manages projects on gender-based violence, human trafficking, and forced labor. Alexandra Robinson is the gender-based violence technical advisor at the UNFPA Technical Division at UN headquarters. She is a qualified lawyer, having worked in Australia and the UK in criminal, family, and child protection law. Please help join me in welcoming our guests. I'd like to start our conversation with a quick excerpt from a Global Citizen article by Tife Sanusi. They write, in 2020, humanitarian organization Plan International carried out surveys based on online experiences around the world. The results indicated that 58% experienced online harassment, with half saying they experienced more harassment online than in the street. While the report highlights that girls are being targeted online just for being young and female, it adds that it gets worse for women and girls who are politically outspoken, disabled, Black, or identify as LGBTQ+. It's pushing women and girls out of online spaces, which are, at the same time, increasingly important for activism, advocating against inequalities and human rights issues, organizing movements, speaking up about personal experiences, and finding community. So to start our conversation, I would love to offer a definition of online or tech-facilitated gender-based violence as it relates to both of your work and or experiences. And we'll start with Vaiddehi.
Okay. I think, so you asked for a definition, right? One of the factors that is complicating measurement and reporting is the fact that there is a lack of consensus on a definition and terminologies. And so it's hard to gather prevalence data, measure impacts, and then implement targeted interventions and policies because we don't have a common definition. But researchers and practitioners have tried to conceptualize a working definition of TFGBV, including, there's one definition by UN Women, I think it's dated 2018, and don't quote me, but it's something to the effect of, TFGBV is any act of gender-based violence that is committed, assisted, or aggravated in part or fully by the use of information communication technologies against a woman because she's a woman, and it continues. So while this definition you see highlights the tech component of TFGBV, it is lacking in my opinion because it misses other vulnerable populations that are frequently impacted by this form of abuse. But there have been recent efforts to kind of develop a working, operationalizable, comprehensive definition that we can test in the field as researchers, as practitioners, as policymakers. And I know UN Women had this meeting last fall where we tried to come together with a working definition. So I know there's been interest and to develop a definition. I personally haven't worked on one, or NORC hasn't, but people are working on it. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Okay, sure. So thanks for having me. But I think on the definition, it's a really interesting question. I think we do need it for data and measurement, but I also think tech is moving so quickly that if we lock down a definition, we're going to, lose women's experience in that definition. And so much of what we as UNFPA are trying to do is look at, if we include questions around TFGBV, and that's technology facilitated gender-based violence, if we include that in population prevalence surveys, you might have one or two questions you can include in that survey. And the problem with that is that if we focus that question on image-based abuse, for example, we're going to miss a whole raft of experiences of women in that country. And I think we also have to recognize that TFGBV is highly contextualized. So what happens in one country can be very different from what happens in another country. The kind of tech that's being used, the kind of online spaces are different depending on the country. And I think some of NORC's research speaks really well to that across the Asia region. But yeah, I would, it's a great definition. It comes from our 2021 report.
I think the same can be said, about the regulatory and compliance aspect. If you put in a certain regulation forward, a certain policy forward, the moving at the speed of tech aspects can sometimes leave certain vulnerable people behind. To that point, what does online gender-based violence look like in terms of the tech companies and the legal system and social support system surrounding it? So in other words, who are the key players in your opinion and the ways that they address it?
I mean, there are researchers and practitioners like us here, but I think the power lies with decision makers who can really drive change, and those are tech companies and governments. In my capacity as a researcher, I can deliver rigorous data to support evidence-based decision making, but that data can only go so far if those who have the power to use it are not using it. So I still see our role somewhat limited in really driving that change. But I think in addition to tech companies, governments, of course, I would be amiss if I also don't acknowledge the role of activists, workplaces or your employer, and also academic institutions. So, starting early with schools, universities, they have a lot that they can do within the institution about raising awareness. Children are being subjected to cyberbullying starting at very young ages because they are using technology, tablets, all of that very young. So I think, in my opinion, these are the kind of key actors. So there's tech, government, and the social actors in terms of your workplace or even your school.
I would only really add having feminist technologists in that space as well. I think so much of the work as UNFPA, we hosted a tech facilitated GBV symposium at the end of last year, largely because we wanted to bridge the gaps between disciplines. And we recognize there's a whole, for UNFPA, we program in 153 countries where we have gender-based violence programming. I don't know how many practitioners have the skills and capacity and are sufficiently literate to be able to communicate with tech companies about what's happening, even how to design tech which is going to be safe and protect women. So there's a whole kind of space there around bridging language and bridging disciplines. So I agree that we need researchers to tell us what the problem is. We need, but we also need people to be able to communicate with tech to hold them to account to their own rules and regulations, as well as with government in terms of their responsibility to protect and promote human rights, including through technology and digital spaces.
Thank you both. I heard you mention children as one of the vulnerable populations. Are there others that we should be aware of that might have intersectional identities in the demographics that we're speaking about? And could you name them?
I can go quickly first. For sure, women at the intersection of discrimination by far and away experience the most prevalent or experience TFGBV. I know, and I can try and pull out the study, I think it was from the Association of Progressive Communications. They surveyed 310 women from the LGBTQI population. 100% had experienced some form of TFGBV. So I think we can say without doubt that particular population are most vulnerable. I would also say female politicians, women activists, women human rights defenders. So any woman who is engaging in online spaces to voice their views and their opinions, particularly if they're not conservative. I think a study came out of the UK this week, which is basically saying 42% of women generally don't want to express an opinion online for fear of attack. So that means that we only have half of the women in the United Kingdom who feel comfortable talking about their lives, let alone activist messaging. So I think there's a huge proportion of, of women, but women in at the intersection of discrimination who will feel it more. And I think also to say, I think technology itself, it is designed for men and for white men in particular. It's designed by white men for white men. And the data, I know, Kat, you can probably, technologists can talk to this a lot better than I can, but the way the algorithms are designed, it's designed, and the way hardware is designed, it's not designed with women at the center. It's women are not engaged in that process in a way that they should be. So I think, there's, Vaiddehi mentioned the amplified kind of component of the definition, and I think that's where it's really critical to understand the role of tech. Sorry, I think I went sideways there.
No, Alex, you covered most of it, but I just want to add, in addition to Alex's point about journalists and activists and human rights defenders who are speaking up, I think we've seen lately that just women in the public eye. So you can be an actor, an athlete, you just have a public presence, and sometimes you are being trolled online. There's a lot of sexual harassment, and then you get threatening messages. Maybe you just did not perform well in a certain match, or your film didn't make the money that you thought it would, or you just seem to have failed the public in a certain way that the public sees it like that. So it's just women in the public eye, women who are opinionated, but also in addition to women, youth, and LGBTQI individuals, you also have racial and religious and ethnic minorities. So we're seeing that a lot, particularly in India, where if you are a Muslim woman or a Muslim and a Dalit woman, your abuse is just amplified because there are so many more layers of intersectionality, and it's to your point. So if you're a black, I forget what you said, black feminist, no.
I'll go back to it so I don't miss.
Women in all their diversity.
Yes, women in all their diversity, basically. So your abuse, your chances
disabled
of,
or
yes,
indigenous. Or,
exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's not just the abuse, but it's not just your chance of being targeted, but the kind of abuse you experience is also amplified. That's all.
I'm hearing that there could be, you can express some structures or norms, societal, digital, that are systemic to the issue of online and tech-facilitated gender-based violence. Could you speak more to the norms that you see that are perpetuating this issue? What's allowing it to keep going, aside from us as a society not putting guardrails? It's,
I can go quickly.
Yeah, talking about technology perpetuating the issue.
Sure. Technology, and then of course society. So we have, and many researchers have already flagged this, that TFGBV is deeply rooted in gender norms and just systemic inequities that intersect with racism, with homophobia, with transphobia, and just other discriminatory structures. And then you have patriarchal cultures that normalize TFGBV in romantic relationships, in family relationships, in friendships, in workplace relationships, and then also just in interactions with strangers in everyday life. So for instance, in our research, we found that findings from South Asia again, you see that TFGBV is so normalized in relationships where like a male partner will exert control over their female partner in the form of, forcing them to share their phone password, giving them, asking them to give access to their social media accounts, or even worse, capturing or filming non-consensual intimate content and threatening to use that at a later time in the relationship if that falls apart, or just threatening to expose them, demanding money. So you have that, but you also have in Pakistan, we found where there's this like concept of kinship where the brother is looking out for the sister, and so the sister's phone is confiscated, and there's just like this element of control that exists. And so these are some kind of structural guardrails that are facilitating TFGBV in addition to the tech landscape. And maybe Alex, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Maybe just a couple of things. One, I would add that what happens in online spaces or through technology is a reflection of the real world, is a reflection of the physical world, but it's amplified through technology. So tech or online spaces that are content agnostic and engagement driven means that misogynistic language is amplified exponentially. So what happens in a physical space is essentially amplified online. The issue obviously with that is that it becomes normalized. So then people witnessing, and this is why this data and this research around witnessing online violence is so important, because it's normalizing TFGBV in those online spaces because it's being amplified. So what might not happen in a physical space is very definitely happening in an online space. Yeah, so I think, thanks.
And just one point to add to that is the way it is amplified is this unique element that tech offers, where you have anonymity, you have vast reach and connectivity, you have easy access, and there's this like concept of or notion of just virtual distance between the perpetrator and the target, so it doesn't feel as tangible. And so because of these factors, the perpetrator can have multiple or even fake identities. And the amplifying factor is the fact that multiple people or multiple perpetrators can join in on the abuse. And that's what amplifies the abuse. It spreads faster than you think. And one of these forms of abuse where you have people mobilized to kind of attack you is gender trolling. So it's the mass organized form of misogynistic abuse where people are mobilized to join in on a to troll a woman because she's a woman.
I want to stay on the thread of the tech companies and content moderation. People are calling on tech companies to do more, but the tech companies and platform provisioners have sort of stated that their online space is like a physical space, to the point that you made. Does that absolve them of content moderation, or how does their role shift in that critique?
I mean, I think most of these platforms have their own rules and regulations around what's acceptable and what's not, a lot of which is driven by acceptable social and gendered norms. The issue is that when you try and hold those tech companies to account for that, you run into problems. So, and largely because many of us, so if I called a tech company and tried to communicate around content moderation, I don't have the right skills or the language to articulate what it is that I need them to do. I don't know how their platforms or the algorithms are designed and managed to be able to address them specifically to support content moderation. I think the other issue is the really heavy reliance on content moderation as a way of regulation. I think we need to understand that as one way that we manage tech. There's a case going on in Kenya at the moment around the language of content moderation and how it is predominantly designed in English. And so where there is abusive, violent language in another, in a different country or within a different ethnic group, that is not being moderated at all, and it's not being picked up because of the language. So I think there's that's some examples, I think, of some of that divide and the responsibility of tech to manage their own platforms. Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning that. That also could speak to the tech company's definition of online gender or tech facilitated gender-based violence, and can kind of help them skirt existing legal frameworks to your point, avoid accountability in certain respects. The legal framework at this time needs help, and I'm wondering from your perspective, Alex, where the shortcomings are from a context that you can speak to at UNFPA, the policy shortcomings that we should be paying attention to for the future of online gender-based violence.
Oh, good question. I don't know if I want to answer.
No.
Whatever. I mean, there are so many great examples of countries that are engaged in law and policy around the issue. Somewhere, they're in a process of designing those policies and laws at the moment. Ultimately, I think the main principle to take away is engage the CSOs, engage the technologists in that process, because if you don't, we're creating laws that can be weaponized against the people it's there to support. So we have PEN America, great group in the US who are working with journalists where laws in those countries have been weaponized against journalists and online women activists. So there's a very, very careful line there about understanding the unintended consequences of laws and policies. And we're really only going to understand and be able to address those if, one, we understand what the TFGBV actually looks like in that country, who the tech are, who are the stakeholders, what is it that we're trying to address, and engage the women CSOs, survivors themselves if they want to be heard, and technologists in that process. It's really, really important to do that. Cynthia Koo in Canada speaks really, really well to the, actually with LEAF, L-E-A-F, an organisation there, speaks really well to the design of law and policy to address TFGBV and some of the major pitfalls that we need to be careful of. One of the really great standards globally would be in Australia. They have, through their legislation, they have set up an e-safety commission, which is an independent regulatory body that operates as, not only does it support safety by design with tech companies who are building tech, they also act as an interface between survivors of violence and the tech companies. So they take on that tech role, they take on that bridging, that sort of language gap that I spoke to before in a really substantive way. And they also track and do the research and the data and a lot of community awareness. So they are, I would say at the moment, Australia is one of the gold standards in terms of global laws and policies, but there are a lot of other countries where they are designing law and policy. The Honourable Tina Jutton in Mauritius has been instrumental in bringing in legislation in Mauritius. We have the Olympia law in Mexico led by, so there's some really, really great CSO activists who've been survivors of TFGBV themselves and have really paved a way for strong laws and policies in those countries. Yeah.
I don't have much more to add. Alex, you kind of hit all the points. The only thing I wanted to say was in some countries, there are laws that are so elements, of TFGBV are embedded in other laws like anti-pornography or anti-obscenity. And so there isn't like a dedicated law for TFGBV, which is how law enforcement kind of skirts that gap. And then when a survivor goes, there is the legal framework is just broken. So in addition to what Australia has done, setting the gold standard there, working with survivors, CSOs and law enforcement even and technologists to kind of reshape the legal framework is in the local context. Again, like to Alex's point, manifestations vary by the local context. So in certain situations, certain forms of abuse are more prevalent. They are targeting a certain group more than maybe in another country that's even the neighboring country. So you cannot really have, what someone once suggested, can we not have an international treaty? And it's just given the nuance of how TFGBV manifests, it just seems like it has to be very country specific with tech companies active in that country and how they are working with the government eventually. Sorry, I think I repeated some of the things Alex already said.
It's okay. I'm happy to hear it. We've alluded obviously to a widening gender gap in internet connectivity that is having people who identify as women on the losing end. A study from the Web Foundation reports that this is averaging up to 50% in parts of Africa. Looking forward, could you expand on the implications of having that half of the population offline?
So aside from the fact that 50% of women don't have to endure TFGBV, there's been a lot of discussion around, the gender digital divide and how inclusive that process needs to be. Do men and women both want access to tech? What tech do they want access to? What do they want to be able to do with it? How do we put women at the center of what it is that they need? And how do we support them in understanding a worldview around tech? Because it's very hard to explain to someone. I don't know, if someone had told my 10-year-old self that there would be a thing called a mobile phone, I would have not, I wouldn't have believed them. Like I had Maxwell Smart and his shoe or whatever it was. But so I think also there's there's a process, and I think, we need to take our time in understanding what the needs are and how to address those in a way that is women-centric and feminist-driven.
And I think to wrap up our conversation, I have one more question. I think it's a forward-looking question. It's for our listeners out there, what would you share to the average end user of the internet, average user? What would you share as like a best practice or a tip or advice to help circumvent the effects of online gender-based violence, acknowledging that the onus is not on them, obviously, to avoid that behavior, but how can we protect ourselves?
That's really hard, because I don't want to be advocating that the responsibility to be safe online rests with women, and rests with survivors, by implication rests with survivors themselves. It's not women's responsibility to be safe online. We have a tech world, we have government, we have law and regulations. We also have some really great tech who are also working to protect our online spaces. So forward-looking, I would be saying, let's use tech against tech. Let's use really great laws and policies to manage and build social services and health services to be responsive to survivors in a way that they need to be. Yeah.
Yep, that is very forward-looking, and like both of you said, the onus should not be on us. But while these laws are developed and enacted, and while tech policies are more survivor-centric, I think in the immediate term, again, not to say that the onus should be on us, but in the immediate term is we've seen that users, of course, with limited digital skills are more at risk, and this has come. This has really come through during the pandemic, when you were prompted to use the internet and digital platforms for the most fundamental things like education, work, social interactions. So, just in the immediate term, if to make your default privacy setting should be like full privacy, because when you're downloading apps, they're not doing that for you. And again, this should not be on you, but the laws and the tech companies aren't changing at the same rate at which we would want. And so if that's something that we can be mindful of going forward.
Thank you for this conversation today. I'm hopeful that the legal frameworks and the support mechanisms of the future will help improve our right to expression and access to information and right to air grievances and everything else. So I'm so glad to have spoken to you today. Thank you.